What's up guys, this is tcgsam here, and in today's video I'm coming at you guys with my top 4 OTS branded Chimera Runick deck. Took it to a local tournament, my first time playing the deck, but we managed to get top 4 with it, and I think this is a pretty solid pick going into the next format. It's quite flexible and adaptable, and I think that has decent matchups across the board. And at the end of the day, since the Runick cards offer you so much different utility, and the Chimera cards just work so well on their own and give you so many resources, I think it's definitely a deck that has good matchups into both control and combo. So with all that being said, let's just hop straight into the deck profile and I'll show you guys what I played. So starting off with the Chimera engine, it's fairly standard. It's just 3 copies of Mirror Sword Knight as the starter. It's your best starter, the one that you always want to see. Playing 3 copies of Gazelle. Gazelle is also pretty solid, even as a normal summon. It's also good for the grind game where you're starting to add a lot of cards from your deck to your hand with like cards like berfomet and whatnot. You just want to make sure you always have targets in your deck for that. This one's a little weird. I was only playing 2 Cornfield. A lot of the other Runick Chimera decks out there, they're also probably playing 1 or 2 of this at most. I personally wanted to play 3 of this, but the reason I ended up not playing 3 was because when you're playing Runick decks specifically, you don't want to be drawing into cards like Cornfield. You want to be drawing into cards like the Runick, like other Runick spells, or like your few non-engine cards that you are able to play. So while Cornfield's an incredibly good starter, and its effect in Graveyard does come up a lot, I just feel like even if you play 2, you're still going to have roughly the same amount of consistency as a normal branded Chimera deck would, because in this deck specifically, Big Wing berfomet is actually not a brick. Rather, it works with any of the Runick cards. You can summon a Hugin, gets this effect, Search Fountain, tribute summon over it, and then there you go. You have access to essentially your full combo with Big Wing berfomet as well. So you still have the same amount of starters as you would in a regular branded Chimera deck, and I think that's pretty solid. To round off the Chimera engine, we're playing 2 copies of Chimera Fusion. I think 2 is sufficient. You don't really want to see this card without having access to your Chimera engine. So I feel like 2 was sufficient. You're able to search it out quite a bit. You could make an argument for playing 3. There was a few times where I would go into Magnum the Reliever and not really want to use this effect to banish 1 from the graveyard to pop a card, since I'd only be left with 1 fusion in that case. But aside from that, I feel like 2 is sufficient. You really don't want to be bricking on this card. And a lot of the times I saw this card in my hand, I just really didn't want it to be there. So I think 2 is a sufficient number for this deck specifically. And then we are playing the branded engine as well, just 3 copies of Branded Fusion and 1 copy of Fallen of Valbaz. You just want to have more starters in your deck, and Branded Fusion provides that for you. You have a lot of cards in this deck that can force out Ash, like the Runick cards themselves, Branded Fusion, and the Chimera cards, so you're really never losing to a single Ash Blossom unless your hand is very bad. That's sort of the idea behind this deck. You don't want to be losing to single hand traps like Imperm on Hugin or Imperm on berfomet, because you have all these other engines you can play with that sort of generate you a lot of advantage on their own. And that's why you should be playing Branded Fusion in a deck like this. Just offers you a lot more power and consistency as well. And then for the Runick engine, this is all very standard, just 3 copies of Tip, best Runick card that you always want to see, 3 copies of Freezing Curses, 3 copies of Flashing Fire, 3 copies of Slumber, because this is the one that you can play going first. Even if your opponent has no cards on their field, you can use this to slumber your own monsters just to activate a Runick spell and get Fountain Draw on your very first turn. It's also pretty solid at protecting Chimera the King on the board to make sure you're able to keep having access to your Mirror Sword Knight and your Cornfield Codal disruptions in the graveyard, since you need to stick King Chimera on the board in order to do that. Runick Slumber is pretty good for that reason. 3 copies of Destruction, and then for the one of Runick spells, just played 1 copy of Smiting Storm and 1 copy of Dispelling. So these are the quote-unquote like bad Runick spells. They don't really do anything. Some builds have been playing like 2 or 3 Dispelling, but I feel like just having 1 in 1 of the names is sufficient. I never use either of their other effects. I've only ever used them to summon Runick monsters. I think it's okay. You can bump this number up to 1 more Dispelling if you really want to play a higher count of Runicks, but I want to fit a bit more non-engine in my deck, so I cut down on it to make it so we had 17 quick play spells overall. 2 copies of Fountain, of course, to round out the Runick engine. And then for the non-engine, this deck doesn't really have space for too many, but I was able to push it to 5 non-engine slots, which I think worked pretty decently. Talent in this deck is always so good because no matter what you draw off of the talent, it's almost always going to be a card that snowballs into more cards. Like no matter if you draw the Branded Fusion, Chimera engine, or the Runick engine, you're just going to get more cards out of it, and it's just such a strong card, both going first and going second. My personal tech this weekend, I played Enemy Controller. So Enemy Controller the idea behind it was you are able to put a lot of bodies on the board very easily with the Runick cards, and this can be good when going first because enemy controller stealing an opponent's monster can sometimes pass their turn completely. Also, going second, I figured it would be good to dodge cards like Impermanence. So like if you summon the berfomet and they activate Imperm or something, you can chain enemy controller, get rid of it, and then you resolve your effect from there. It worked pretty well for me throughout the weekend, and I don't think I change it in the future. It's definitely a pretty solid card that gives you an extra layer of disruption that your opponent may not be expecting. And then the last card I played was just one copy of Called by the Grave, just to make sure your plays go through, because while Ash isn't an auto loss for you, you still would prefer for all of your engines to get rolling, so Called by the Grave is pretty solid for that reason. Moving on to the extra deck, I played 2 copies of Chimera, the King of Phantom Beast. I think this is all you need. I wasn't playing the other Chimera fusion, like the new one from Age of Overlord. I didn't feel like its effect was really that useful because there weren't that many good targets in this deck specifically to send, which is why I didn't end up playing it. I don't think it's really needed, and the extra deck space in this deck is fairly tight. Next up, we're playing 2 copies of Guardian Chimera. You just need 2 because you're going to be going into one very often with the first Chimera fusion, and you just want access to a second one later on for follow-up or to push further into your opponent's board. So not much to really say about it. It's just one of the best fusion monsters you can make. And then 1 copy of Magnum the Reliever. I think Magnum is pretty solid because you can use the Runick monsters in your extra monster zone to clear the extra monster zone, and now you can use more Runick cards to summon to your extra monster zone after you summon Magnum. Like I mentioned when I was talking about the Chimera fusion, there were times where I wish I did play 3 so I'd be able to use this pop effect a little more liberally. I wouldn't have to worry about getting rid of all my fusion spells afterwards, and I did want to sometimes put back Chimera fusion and draw one, but I needed it engraved to have disruption on my opponent's turn. So that's something to consider if you do choose to play this deck, but I would say Magnum is definitely a pretty solid card. I didn't really find a need for cards like Dragostapelia. For the Runick fusions, play 1 copy of Sleipnir. So Sleipnir is incredibly good at forcing stuff out when going second, and it lets you do a few battle phase tricks to protect your Chimera, the King of Phantom Beast as well. So it's just honestly a really great card. It also makes your quote-unquote bad Runick spells actually turn into pressure on your first main phase. So if you have Dispelling, that's going to force an interruption out from then on, and that's actually really good because you don't need to spend your actual Runick disruptions to force something out. 1 copy of Jerry. Jerry's pretty standard. It's also a beast, which is nice, so you can use Chimera fusion with it. And then 2 copies of Hugent. And this is all you really need for the Runick fusions, just 4. I do side another Runick fusion, but aside from that, I never found myself needing more than just these 4. For the branded engine, we're playing 1 copy of Lubellion and 1 copy of Albion for like the fusion ones. Not much to really say about these. There aren't great targets to send in the main deck, but you still should be playing these just for the hands where you have access to the Chimera engine already and you're just trying to make Mirror Jade. These are not bad options to go into. Rinrum's probably my favorite one to go into because it gets access to your Chimera engine, and I find that its disruption effect can actually be pretty solid. Plus, it's a threat your opponent has to respect even after they clear it off the board, because you're going to be able to summon Albaz during their turn and at any time and turn that into a Mirror Jade or something, and that just causes a lot of problems for your opponent. Speaking of Mirror Jade, we are playing the 1 copy of Mirror Jade, of course. Can't be playing Branded Fusion without it. And then for the last 2 cards in the extra deck, they were sort of like quote-unquote flex slots. The first one I played was Muckraker. So Muckraker, the idea behind it was since a lot of your best monsters are fiends, like Big Wing Berfomet and Chimera, the King of Mythical Beast, I figured that having access to a bunch of random bodies on the board that you can just turn into a very powerful monster can be incredibly good. You can bring back those cards and get your engine just rolling all over again. I will mention though, I do think that you could be playing SP Little Knight in this slot instead. I just didn't have access to it for this tournament. But for the future, I think I would probably consider SP just because of how powerful of a card it is. And this didn't really ever come up for me because most of my opponents recognized that it was optimal for them to scoop at an earlier time because I had already amassed so much advantage. So that's sort of why this card never came up. But in theory, it was pretty good. And then finally, 1 copy of Baguska. Baguska is good for when you get barriered or shifted. You're just able to activate any Runick spell, summon out Jerry, normal summon any of your Chimera engine, summon this, and that buys you an extra turn. Another cool play with Baguska is you can bring it back with both Muckraker and the Chimera since it is a fiend. So that can be used to stop 1 turn from your opponent, just essentially skip their next turn. And then even though it dies in the standby phase, you're going to be able to just buy yourself another turn. And that's sort of all this deck needs. You just need to survive. and from there your engine is just so powerful when it starts to get rolling. A lot of decks out there are just not going to be able to compete with the resource game that you're able to amass. And then just quickly going over the side deck that I played, it could change for future events, but just for that specific event, it was supposed to be 3 Radians. I didn't have a 3rd Radian, but this was just out problems like the Pearly Towers. It is also a Fiend, so you can use it with Chimera Fusion. 3 copies of Cosmic. This was specifically for the anti-spells I thought I'd be seeing. Didn't run into any, but it was pretty solid against matchups like Labyrinth. I did play 3 copies of Phantasme. This was the only hand trap I actually chose to run, and the reason for that was I didn't want to make my opponent's thrust and talents as live as often as possible, but also I figured that Phantasme was incredibly good because it fixes your hand and allows you to use your engine to break boards. Like, the great thing I found when playing this deck was that even if you draw a hand full of Runick spells, that's still going to be able to push through something, and the fact that Phantasme can help you mold your hand to see like non-duplicate Runick spells or just search the most powerful ones has been incredibly important. I didn't really get decided in, considering my matchups didn't really warrant playing Phantasme, but I would say in general Phantasme was a pretty solid choice, and I would probably run it again if I were to play this deck again. There can be only one. This is sort of like the almost quote-unquote like auto win against some of the decks out there. Even when going second against decks like Rika and Avalon, for example, they're probably not going to be able to deal with There Can Be Only One, and at that point, like, you're just so far ahead. So There Can Be Only One is sort of like an auto win against a lot of decks out there, like Rika and Avalon, Dragon Link. Heck, even going second against those decks, this can be okay if you pair it with a few of the other cards to protect it. So just having access to this card is just incredibly strong, and it definitely won me a few games at the tournament. And then I played just 1 copy of each of the shufflers. This was specifically for tier and graveyard-based matchups. You have a lot of discard outlets in the Runicks. You can use them as fusion material from the hand, and they were pretty good overall. And finally, just 1 copy of Moonin. Unfortunately, when you are playing a Runick deck, you do tend to have longer games. With all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.